He stripped the necklace from his wife's throat in front of every man who feared him, and before the clasp settled against his mistress's skin, Dante Vescari had already lost everything he thought he owned. The bloodstone. The ancient Vescari bloodstone necklace. 47 years old, rubies set in oxidized silver, worn by every woman who ever stood at the right hand of a Vescari Don. Not a gift, not decoration, a declaration. The five families knew what it meant. Every soldier in every room of that club knew what it meant. The woman who wore the bloodstone was the woman the Dons recognized as the spine of the empire, the one you didn't touch, the one you didn't cross. Because she wasn't just a wife, she was the guarantee. Dante Vescari lifted it from Elena's neck like he was returning a borrowed coat. He expected applause. He got silence so complete you could hear the ice settling in the whiskey glasses. Then one by one, every Don at that table stood up. No words, no ceremony. They simply rose from their chairs and walked out into the New York night, and the sound of the door closing behind the last one was the quietest, most devastating thing Dante Vescari had ever heard in 43 years of living. Elena didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at him across the table with eyes that had already moved past grief into something colder and more final, and she said, "You just gave away the one thing you never understood. If you've ever watched someone you love hand your life to a stranger and smile while they did it, if you've ever been the last person in the room to understand what just happened, then you already know exactly what this story feels like. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next to Dante Vescari, to Elena, and to the necklace that started all of it, you will not see coming." The club was called Meridian. No sign on the door, no listing in any directory, a brownstone on a block where the streetlights had been broken long enough that nobody bothered reporting it anymore. You got in because someone who already belonged vouched for you, and if they ever stopped vouching, you stopped existing as far as Meridian was concerned. The five families had been meeting there for 19 years. The booths were deep, the lighting was low, and the staff had been selected specifically for their ability to be invisible. Dante had chosen Meridian for tonight on purpose. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the moment to have weight, to have audience, because in his mind, in the specific catastrophic architecture of his thinking, what he was about to do was a coronation. He was elevating Siena. He was making a statement about what the Vescari name meant going forward, about modernity, about his willingness to rewrite the old rules. He had not consulted Elena. He had not consulted anyone. That was the first mistake, and it lived inside every mistake that followed. Elena Marcelli had been 19 years old when she married Dante Vescari. She was 38 now, and in the 19 years between those 2 points, she had done things that Dante had watched without ever fully seeing. She had sat in on meetings he dismissed as formality and memorized every face, every name, every unspoken tension. She had cultivated relationships with the wives and sisters and daughters of men Dante considered subordinate, and through those relationships had built a secondary architecture of loyalty that ran parallel to Dante's own, quieter and deeper and far more durable. She had managed the Vescari family's legitimate holdings, the shipping concerns, the import licenses, the charitable foundation that provided very useful cover for certain financial movements, with a precision that 3 separate accountants had described privately as extraordinary. Dante knew she was capable. He had simply never understood what that capability was actually doing. He thought of her as competent support. She was, in fact, the load-bearing wall. She wore the bloodstone on a chain against her collarbone, the rubies dark as old wine, the silver worn smooth in places from decades of handling. She had worn it for 11 years since Dante's father Romano had clasped it around her neck himself at a dinner that Dante had attended but not fully understood. Romano had said at that dinner that the necklace went to the person the empire most needed. He had looked at Dante when he said it. Dante had assumed it was a compliment. It wasn't. Sienna Vale arrived at Meridian that night in a black dress that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, her dark hair pinned up, her expression composed in the particular way of someone who is very good at performing composure. She was 31. She had been in Dante's orbit for 14 months. She was not naive, and she was not simple, and the role she was actually playing in this story was considerably more complicated than the one Dante believed she occupied. But that comes later. What matters now is the moment itself. The table. The 8 men who represented the 5 most powerful criminal organizations on the eastern seaboard, seated around aged wood under crystal light, whiskey in front of most of them, the specific quality of attention in the room that only exists when men who have survived a great deal are watching something they don't yet understand. Dante stood up. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome in his 20s and had since settled into something more formidable than attractive. He carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never had a room fail to respond to him, and he carried it into this room the same way because it had never occurred to him that a room might not respond. "Gentlemen," he said, "I want to mark tonight as the beginning of something new for the Vescari family." He looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Her face was perfectly still. He reached across and unclasped the bloodstone from her neck. The sound in the room was not a sound. It was an absence of sound, sudden and total, the way air pressure drops before something breaks. Dante walked to where Sienna sat and placed the necklace around her throat. He said, "The Vescari name moves forward tonight." Nothing happened for 3 full seconds. Then Don Aurelio Ferrante, who was 71 years old and had not raised his voice in a meeting in over a decade, pushed his chair back from the table and stood up. He didn't speak. He straightened his jacket, picked up his hat from the seat beside him, and walked toward the exit. Marco Lenza stood next, then Christoph Brauer, then the Delacroix brothers simultaneously, as if they'd rehearsed it, their chairs scraping back in almost perfect unison. The last one to stand was Vincent Corvo, who was the oldest Don in the room and the one who had known Romano Vescari longest. He stood slowly, the way old men stand when their joints cost them something, and he looked at Dante for a moment, not with anger, not with contempt, with something closer to sorrow. And then he walked out. The door closed. Dante stood in the center of the room with the bloodstone around Sienna's neck and the wreckage of the moment settling over him like sediment, and he still didn't fully understand what had happened. Elena stood up from her chair. She smoothed the front of her dress. She picked up her clutch from the table. She said very quietly, so only Dante could hear, "You just gave away the one thing you never understood." And then she walked out of Meridian, and her footsteps on the hardwood were the only sound in the building. Dante looked at Sienna. Sienna looked back at him, and there was something in her expression, there and gone, fast as a blink, that he couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not even satisfaction, something more like grief. He didn't ask her about it. That was the second mistake. He poured himself a drink instead and told himself the Dons were being theatrical. They'd come around. They always came around. Opte. He drove back to the Vescari estate at 2 in the morning, slightly drunk, still constructing in his head the argument for why tonight had been a statement of strength rather than an error. The estate was a 14-room property north of the city, gated, manicured, the kind of house that said old money to anyone who saw it, even though the money was considerably older than it was legitimate. Elena's car was in the drive. The lights in the east wing were off. He found her in the kitchen, of all places, sitting at the island with a cup of tea gone cold and a ledger open in front of her that she closed when he walked in. Not hurriedly, deliberately. The way you close something because you're done with it, not because you're hiding it. "We need to talk," Dante said. "Do we?" The Dons overreacted. Elena looked at him for a moment. "Aurelio Ferrante has been at that table since before you were born," she said. "He doesn't overreact. He'll be back when he's calmed down." Dante. She said his name in a particular way, flat and final, the way you say a word you're tired of. "Aurelio Ferrante's eldest son has already called me. So has Marco Lenza's wife. So has Corvo's attorney." She paused. "That happened in the 2 hours since we left the club." Something cold moved through Dante's chest. "What did they say?" "They asked if I needed anything." He stared at her. "They called you?" "Yes." "Not me, E." "No." She picked up the cold tea, looked at it, set it back down. "Not you." He pulled out the stool across from her and sat down. The kitchen felt very large suddenly, or he felt very small in it, one of those two things. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I was fine and that I appreciated the call." She looked at him steadily. "Which is true. I am fine. The fact that they felt the need to call at all is the part you should be thinking about. They called to check on you because they felt bad about the... They called to check on me, Elena said, because the bloodstone was around my neck, and then it wasn't. And in 19 years of marriage to you, those men have learned that the thing most worth paying attention to in the Vescari organization is usually me. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Dante said, I'm not angry, she said. I want you to know that. I'm past angry. I'm something else now, and I haven't decided what to do with it yet, but it isn't anger. She closed the ledger and stood up. Go to sleep, Dante. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. She left him in the kitchen. He sat there for a long time. At 4 a.m, his phone started ringing. What? The first call was from his financial manager, a nervous man named Pellegrino, who had managed the Vescari accounts for 6 years, and who never called before 8 unless something was actively on fire. Dante answered it with the particular dread of someone who already suspects what's coming. The Bayside accounts, Pellegrino said without greeting. They've been frozen. Frozen how? Frozen as in the access code stopped working at 3:15 this morning. All 4 accounts. I've tried the backup protocols and the secondary. Get someone on it. I've been on it for 40 minutes. The accounts aren't frozen from the outside. They're frozen from the inside. Someone changed the authorization. Dante was already moving toward his office. Who has that kind of access? A pause on the line. Very short. Very loaded. Officially? You and your wife. He stopped walking. The last access event logged, Pellegrino continued, voice carefully neutral, was at 2:47 this morning, after you arrived home from Meridian. Dante stood in the hallway of his own house and felt the floor do something complicated under his feet. Don't do anything yet, he said. Don't touch any of the accounts. I'll call you back. He hung up and called his head of security, a man named Cruz, who picked up on the second ring and reported that 3 of the 5 safe houses in the city had gone dark. Phones disconnected, no response to the check-in protocols, the staff simply absent, not attacked, not raided, just gone. Quietly. Overnight. And the soldiers? Dante said. A pause. I've reached about 60% of the roster. The other 40, Cruz hesitated. Nobody's answering. Dante ended the call. He stood in his hallway, in his shirt and slacks from the night before, tie gone, jacket gone, the Meridian evening still on him like a smell he couldn't wash out, and he thought about Elena closing that ledger in the kitchen, about the calls from the Don's families, about Aurelio Ferrante standing up without a word, about what Elena had said, very precisely. I'm past angry. I'm something else now. He went upstairs. He knocked on the door of the room Elena used when she chose to sleep separately, which had been most nights for the past 8 months. No answer. He opened the door. The room was empty. The bed was made. Her reading glasses were on the nightstand. Everything else was gone. Not dramatically gone. No drawers open, no mess, no evidence of departure. Just cleanly, efficiently absent. As if she had packed long before last night and had simply been waiting for the specific moment that would make leaving make sense. Dante sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Then he went downstairs and called Rafe Calder. Rafe was his lieutenant, his closest advisor, the man who had been at his right hand for 11 years through everything from hostile takeovers to federal investigations, to the specific kind of crisis that required someone who could think clearly and act without hesitation. Rafe was 41, lean, with a stillness about him that people frequently mistook for calm. It wasn't calm. It was control. There was a difference. Rafe answered immediately. I need you here, Dante said. I'm already in the car, Rafe said. I've been up since 4. I heard about the accounts. Something about that, the immediacy of it, the fact that Rafe had already heard, registered somewhere in Dante's mind and then slipped away because he had too many other things pressing on him to catch it. Elena's gone, Dante said. Gone how? Gone as in her things are gone and she's not here. Another pause. Different quality from Pellegrino's pause. Do you want me to find her? Not yet, Dante said. Get here first. I need to think. He hung up and went to pour himself coffee, and while the coffee was brewing, he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the gray 5 a.m. sky and tried to assemble what he knew into a shape that made sense. Accounts frozen by someone with authorized access. Safe houses cleared. Soldiers not answering. Don's families calling Elena, not him. Elena gone before sunrise with no drama and no mess. The Dons had walked out because of the necklace. But everything else, the accounts, the houses, the soldiers, that was operational. That was structure. That didn't happen overnight because someone was offended at a dinner. That happened because it had been arranged. Dante set down his coffee mug very carefully. Elena had said, "I'm past angry. I'm something else now." She hadn't said it like a woman who'd just been humiliated. She'd said it like a woman who had already decided what came next and was simply telling him the current status of her interior state for his own information. "I haven't decided what to do with it yet." He had taken that to mean she hadn't decided whether to be furious or grief-stricken or cold. He understood now that she had meant something considerably more literal. She had the accounts. She had, for reasons he was only beginning to grasp, the loyalty of the soldiers. She had the relationships with the Don's families. She had 19 years of maintenance on the infrastructure of his empire. Maintenance he had watched without ever seeing. And she had apparently been holding the whole architecture together in ways that he had never bothered to investigate because it had never occurred to him that it required investigation. He had believed the empire was his because his name was on it. He had not understood, until this specific morning, in this specific kitchen, that a name on a building doesn't mean you know how the plumbing works. Rafe arrived 20 minutes later, and they sat across from each other at the island where Elena had sat with her cold tea and her ledger, and Rafe listened to everything. The accounts, the houses, the soldiers, Elena gone, with his particular quality of controlled stillness. When Dante finished, Rafe said, "There's something else." "What?" "Sienna Vale." Rafe looked at him steadily. "She called me this morning, before I called you. She said she needed to tell you something that she couldn't say at Meridian." He paused. "She said the necklace. She said she knew what it meant." Dante stared at him. "She knew." "That's what she said. She knew what it meant and she didn't—" He stopped. "She said she tried to stop you," Rafe said carefully. "Last week. She said she told you the families had rules about the bloodstone." Dante remembered, suddenly and completely, a conversation in his car 7 days ago. Sienna saying something about traditions, about the necklace, about being careful. He had kissed her and told her she worried too much. He had not listened. He put his hands flat on the counter and breathed. "Where is she?" he said. "She's at the Midtown apartment. I need to talk to her." Dante. Rafe said his name the same flat way Elena had said it in this same kitchen 4 hours ago. "Before you go, there's one more thing." He reached into his jacket and set a small object on the counter between them. It was a photograph, old, the edges worn, showing two men shaking hands across a table that Dante recognized with a lurch as the table at Meridian. One of the men was Romano Vescari, Dante's father. The other was a man Dante had seen in photographs before, Aurelio Ferrante's predecessor, the Don who had died in the early 90s. Behind them, half in shadow, barely visible, was a young woman, 20 or so. Dark hair. A face that Dante stared at for a long time before he placed it. Elena, 20 years younger, at a meeting that had supposedly happened 5 years before she'd ever met Dante. "Where did you get this?" Dante said. "It arrived this morning," Rafe said, "in an envelope addressed to me. No return address." He paused. It wasn't the only thing in the envelope. He set a folded piece of paper beside the photograph. Dante opened it. It was a single-typed line. "Ask Elena what's inside the necklace." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the sun was coming up over the estate grounds, gray and flat and without warmth, and Dante Vescari sat in his kitchen with a photograph of his dead father and the wife he thought he knew, and a question he didn't yet understand, and the empire he had believed was solid beneath him, continued quietly and methodically to come apart at every seam. Dante sat with the photograph and the folded note for 4 minutes without speaking, which was unusual for him because Dante Vescari was not a man who sat with things quietly. He was a man who moved, who acted, who filled silence with decision. Rafe had watched him for 11 years and could count on one hand the number of times he'd seen Dante go still like this, and every one of those times something significant had broken. This was the worst of them. "You didn't open the envelope until you got here," Dante said finally. It wasn't a question. "No." "Why?" Rafe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Because whatever was in it, I thought you should see it first. Dante looked at him. Not the way he normally looked at Rafe, not the comfortable look of a man regarding someone he trusted absolutely, but a new look, slightly angled, slightly measuring. Rafe noticed it. He had been waiting for it. You've known Elena a long time, Dante said. 11 years. Same as you and me. You ever have a conversation with her that I didn't know about? The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee maker had finished its cycle, and the only sound was the refrigerator, and faintly, the early morning birds outside. We've talked, Rafe said carefully. She's your wife. We've been in the same rooms for 11 years. That's not what I asked. Rafe looked at him directly. Nothing operational, nothing about the business. Dante folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. He picked up the photograph and looked at it again. His father's face, the old Don across the table, and Elena at 20, standing in shadow she shouldn't have been in. How old would she have been when this was taken? If the date on the back is right, 19 or 20. Before she met me. Yes. She told me she had no connection to any of the families before we married. That our meeting was… He stopped. Coincidental, Rafe said. That's what she told me too. Early on, when I asked. Dante set the photograph down. You asked her. I vetted her. When you first brought her around, you asked me to. And she said coincidental. She said she'd grown up adjacent to this world through her father's business contacts, but had no direct involvement. Rafe paused. That could still be technically true, depending on what that photograph represents. She's standing 20 feet from my father and the Ferrante predecessor at a meeting that predates our introduction by 5 years. That's not adjacent. Dante's voice had gone very flat. That's embedded. Rafe said nothing. Dante stood up. He'd made a decision, the way he always made decisions. Fast, forward, without fully accounting for what he didn't know. It was the quality that had made him effective and the quality that had made him catastrophic, often simultaneously. I'm going to the Midtown apartment. I'm talking to Sienna. Dante. Something's been arranged. Whatever happened last night, whatever's happening with the accounts and the houses and the soldiers, it didn't happen because Elena got angry at a dinner. This was built. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Sienna's been next to me for 14 months. She knows something. She said she'd call you herself. If you go there now without… I'm not waiting for her to call. Rafe stood too. Let me come with you. Dante looked at him for a moment. That new look again, the one with the angle to it. No, he said. Stay here. Monitor the accounts. If Pellegrino calls, tell him to wait. He paused at the kitchen door. And Rafe, find out who sent that envelope. He left without looking back. Rafe stood alone in the Vescari kitchen for a moment. Then he took out his own phone, scrolled to a number, and pressed call. It rang twice. When the line connected, he didn't say hello. He said, "He's moving, Midtown." A pause on the other end. Then a woman's voice, low, precise, unhurried, said, "I know. Let him come." The line went dead. Rafe set his phone on the counter next to the photograph of Romano Vescari and the woman who had apparently been positioned inside Dante's life long before Dante had ever noticed her. He poured himself a cup of Dante's coffee and waited. The Midtown apartment was a 16th floor unit in a building Dante kept under a corporate name, used for meetings that didn't happen in the official ledger, and for housing people he wanted kept comfortable and close. Sienna had been living there for 8 months. She had decorated it with the particular care of someone who understood they were in a temporary arrangement and was making the best of it. Good furniture, real art, a kitchen that actually had food in it, signs of a woman who was genuinely present rather than just occupying space. Dante let himself in with his key at 6:45 in the morning. Sienna was awake. She was sitting on the couch in a sweater and slacks, no makeup, her dark hair loose, a cup of coffee in both hands. She looked like she hadn't slept, which she hadn't. She looked at him when he came in and she didn't look surprised. That registered. "You knew I was coming," he said. "I knew you'd come eventually." She watched him cross the room and stop in front of her. "Sit down, Dante." "I'll stand." "Okay." She set down the coffee. "Then I'll talk and you'll stand and try not to do whatever you're thinking about doing." "You knew what the necklace meant." "Yes." The word hit him like something physical. He'd known it was coming, Rafe had told him. But the directness of it, no preamble, no defense, just yes, stopped him for a full second. "You knew," he said, "and you let me—" "I didn't let you do anything. I told you. In the car. A week ago. I told you the families had protocols around the bloodstone and that moving it publicly would be interpreted as, Dante, I told you exactly what would happen." Her voice wasn't raised. That was almost worse. "You kissed me and told me I worried too much. You could have— What, refused to go? Refused to let you put it on me?" She looked at him. "And then what? You do it anyway, and I'm the woman who made a scene at the table. At least this way—" She stopped. "At least this way what?" She looked at her hands. There was something happening behind her face that he couldn't read, a calculation or a grief or some combination of the two. "At least this way I was there. I could watch what happened." "What does that mean? Why would you need to watch?" Sienna looked up at him. "Sit down, Dante. Please. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it sitting down." He sat. He didn't want to, but something in her voice moved him to the chair across from her, and he sat in it with his elbows on his knees and waited with the specific coiled patience of a man who expects bad news and wants it fast. She said, "I've been in contact with Elena." The room did something. "For how long?" Dante said. His voice was extremely quiet. "About 7 months." 7? He stopped himself, breathed. "You've been talking to my wife for 7 months. She contacted me. At first I wasn't sure what she wanted. I thought it might be about you, about the two of us." Sienna's hands were clasped in her lap, pressed together hard enough that her knuckles were pale. "But it wasn't. She wasn't angry about us. She paused, searching for the right word. "Pragmatic. She said she needed someone on the inside, someone close enough to you to watch specific people." "Specific people," Dante repeated. "One person," Sienna said. "She said one person." His jaw tightened. "Who?" Sienna looked at him steadily. "She said she needed someone watching Rafe Calder." The name fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Dante didn't move for a moment. Then he stood up. Then he sat back down. Then he pressed both hands against his face and held them there, breathing into his palms. And when he lowered them, his expression had shed whatever was left of the morning's composure, and what remained was rawer and more dangerous. "Rafe," he said. "She said she had reason to believe he'd been building something parallel to your organization for 2 years. Running contacts you didn't know about, diverting resources, compiling documentation." Sienna's voice was steady, but her hands were still pressed together. "She needed someone who could be near you without raising suspicion, near the operation without being read as a threat." She met his eyes. "She said I was the only person Rafe wouldn't watch carefully because he didn't consider me a factor." "She used you," Dante said. "She asked me. There's a difference." "Is there?" "She told me what was at stake. She told me about the necklace, what it meant, why it mattered. She said your enemies were circling and the only way to bring them into the open was to create a moment dramatic enough to force movement." Sienna's voice dropped slightly. "Last night was that moment. The bloodstone going to me publicly. She knew what the Dons would do. She knew they'd walk out. She knew it would look like your empire cracking. She needed it to look that way." Dante stared at her. "The accounts, the soldiers, the safe houses." "Controlled," Sienna said. "She pulled them back deliberately, not to destroy you, to make anyone watching believe you were actually vulnerable, to see who moved." "Who moved?" Sienna looked at him for a long moment. "Dante, your phone is going to ring in about 10 minutes. When it does—" His phone rang. He looked at it. "Unknown number," he answered. The voice on the other end was Elena's, calm, direct, no greeting. She said, "Don't say anything, just listen. Rafe Calder made 3 calls in the last hour. One to an attorney named Greer, who represents the Castillo organization. One to a federal contact whose name I'll give you later. And one to me." A pause. "He told me you'd gone to Midtown. He said, and I want you to hear this carefully, he said you were becoming unstable and that it might be necessary to accelerate the timeline." Dante's entire body went very still. "He has a file," Elena continued. "Original documentation, not copies. Evidence from the Hargrove situation 6 years ago. 18 people. He's been holding it for 2 years as insurance. and now he's deciding whether to use it to take over your operation or sell it to the federal contact. Her voice was measured and precise, the voice of someone reporting facts they've known for a long time. He called me because he thought I was on his side. He's been cultivating me as an ally for 8 months. He thinks I'm angry enough at you to cooperate. Are you? Dante said. The word came out rough, barely voice. I'm angry enough at you to have let last night happen the way it did, Elena said. I'm not angry enough to hand you to Rafe Calder. She paused. Get out of Midtown. Don't go back to the estate, and don't call Rafe. Another pause, shorter. There's a location I'll text you. Go there. Come alone. The line went dead. Dante sat with the dead phone in his hand and looked at Sienna. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite vindication, but something uncomfortable between the two. You knew all of this, he said. I knew pieces. Elena doesn't tell anyone everything. But you knew enough. 7 months ago, you knew enough to… He stopped. He was thinking about 14 months, about every conversation in that time, every confidence he'd lowered in her presence, every moment he'd let his guard slip because she was just Sienna, just the woman he'd chosen for reasons that now seemed very thin. Was any of it real? He said. Between us. Sienna held his gaze. She didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer, but then she said quietly, the parts that were real were real. I didn't manufacture caring about you. I just also had a job to do. She unclasped her hands. That's probably not what you want to hear. No, he said. It's not. He stood up and took his jacket. At the door, he stopped. He didn't turn around. The necklace last night. When I put it on you. He was quiet for a moment. Your expression. What was that? He heard Sienna exhale. Grief, she said. Because I knew what it meant, and I knew what was about to happen, and I knew you didn't. A pause. Nobody had ever looked at me the way you looked at me in that moment. Like I was the answer to something. Her voice stayed even, but there was a quality underneath it. And the entire time, I knew I was about to watch it fall apart. Dante nodded once, very slightly. He opened the door. He left. In the elevator going down, he stood with his back against the wall and his eyes on the floor numbers, and he didn't allow himself to feel anything about what Sienna had just said, because he couldn't afford it. He had the note in his shirt pocket. He had Elena's call. He had 11 years of trusting Rafe Calder pressing against the new shape of the morning. He walked out of the building and into the gray city air and got in his car and drove. The location Elena texted was a machine shop in the garment district. Legitimate business on the outside, owned through 3 intermediary companies that traced back to a Marcelli family holding, which Dante recognized as Elena's people, which meant she'd had infrastructure of her own this whole time, and he was only now finding out where it was. He drove for 40 minutes, checking his mirror compulsively, changing lanes without pattern. Nobody followed him, or if they did, they were better at it than he was at spotting it. The shop was closed to outside business on Saturday mornings. A man he didn't recognize let him in through a side entrance without speaking and led him through the smell of metal and machine oil to a back office where Elena was waiting. She was seated at a work table. She still wore the clothes from last night. She hadn't been to the estate, hadn't changed, had apparently been moving since she walked out of Meridian and hadn't stopped. She looked tired in a specific way, not exhausted but wrung, the kind of tired that comes from sustaining something difficult over a long time. The bloodstone was on the table in front of her. Dante stopped when he saw it. You have it. How do you… He looked at Sienna, not Sienna, at Elena. His brain was doing something it hadn't done in years, skipping, catching, trying to process information that kept outrunning his assumptions. You have the necklace. I've always been able to get it back, Elena said. It responds to the Marcelli authentication, not the Vescari. Your father designed it that way. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The table between them felt both necessary and impossible. Tell me about my father. Romano was afraid of you, Elena said. Not cruelly, just factually. Not of who you were when he died. Of who you might become if the empire went to you unchecked. She looked at him evenly. He loved you. That's not in question. But love and trust aren't the same thing, and he knew your weaknesses before you knew them yourself. He chose you. He chose my family. My father had been Romano's most trusted advisor for 30 years. When Romano realized he was dying, He made an arrangement. The Marcelli family would maintain the alliances, the legitimacy, the operational infrastructure. The Vescari name would continue, but the actual authority, the real ledger, would rest with us until... She paused. Until what? Dante said. Until you showed you could lead without burning everything around you. She looked at him. He said you had the instincts, but not the patience. He said the patience could be learned, but only through loss. The office was very quiet. Somewhere in the shop, a machine was running, a low, steady vibration through the floor. The necklace, Dante said. There's a compartment in the clasp mechanism. Very small. It contains a microfilm strip. She touched the necklace but didn't pick it up. On it is documentation of a pact your father made with all 5 families in 1987. A mutual protection agreement. What it essentially means is that any action taken against the Vescaris could be construed as action against all 5 families, and vice versa. Your father used it twice to stop moves against him that would otherwise have succeeded. She met his eyes. It's also documentation that could, in the wrong hands, be used to apply pressure to every major family simultaneously. It's not just protection, it's leverage. And Rafe knows about it. Rafe has been trying to find the compartment for 2 years. He knows it exists from a source he's never named to me. He knows it's somewhere in the necklace. He doesn't know the clasp mechanism or the authentication. She looked at him steadily. When you moved the necklace to Sienna last night, he thought he'd finally be able to get his hands on it. Dante's throat felt very dry. Because Sienna was working with you. And Rafe didn't know that. He thought Sienna was isolated, vulnerable, a woman who'd just been handed enormous symbolic power without the relationships to protect it. He thought he could approach her. Elena's expression didn't change. Instead, she'd have called me. The whole night, Dante said slowly, the whole performance at Meridian, you needed the necklace to be somewhere Rafe thought he could reach it. I needed Rafe to commit, to make an actual move rather than just preparing one. People like Rafe don't act until they're certain the moment is right. I needed to create a moment so perfect that he couldn't resist it. She looked at him. You gave it to me. I didn't plan for it to be that particular moment or that particular night. But when you told me 2 days ago that you were going to make the announcement at Meridian, I told you 2 days ago, Dante said. He heard his own voice from a distance. In the car, on the way to dinner. Yes. And I called Sienna that night. I called the Don's families the next morning, not to warn them, but to ensure they'd be watching carefully. I positioned everything around the moment you'd already chosen. She paused. I didn't take the moment from you, Dante. You provided it. He sat with that. The machine vibration continued through the floor. His coffee from the estate was long gone, and he hadn't eaten anything since the previous afternoon, and he was aware of his own body in an unpleasant way. The dried-out scrape of fatigue behind his eyes, the tight, wrong feeling in his chest that might have been anger or might have been something more vulnerable that he wasn't ready to name. The Hargrove file, he said. Rafe has original documentation. Yes. 18 people. Yes. He rubbed his jaw. If he goes to the federal contact, he won't. Not immediately. He'll use it as leverage to take control of the operation first. That's what the call this morning was about. Accelerating the timeline. He wants your organization intact, not dismantled. She paused. He wants your chair. So we have a window. A small one. She looked at him. Dante, I need you to understand something before we go further. I didn't build any of this to protect you from consequences you earned. The Hargrove situation, whatever happened there, that's yours. I can't make that disappear, and I wouldn't. Her voice was level. What I can do is make sure that if you face it on your terms and not Rafe Calder's. There's a difference between justice and being handed over by a man who wants your empire. Dante looked at the necklace on the table between them. The rubies under the office's flat light, the worn silver, the clasp that apparently contained 30 years of leverage, and a test he hadn't known he was taking. You've been doing this for 19 years, he said. 11 years married, she said. 8 years before that, getting ready. He looked up at her. My father placed you. My father agreed. I agreed. A pause. I was 19 and I thought I knew what I was agreeing to. I was right about some of it. Something shifted in her face, briefly, too quickly to name. I didn't account for... She stopped. For what? She looked at the necklace instead of him, for it being complicated. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't sure he was entitled to do anything with it. He filed it somewhere and moved forward because moving forward was the only thing he knew. "What do you need from me?" he said. Elena looked at him for a moment. The question had surprised her. He could see it, because it was the right question, the question she'd been waiting 19 years to hear him ask, and it had taken the complete collapse of his certainty to bring it out of him. "I need you to do exactly what I tell you," she said, "for once, without arguing and without deciding you know better halfway through." He nodded. "All right." "There's a meeting," she said, "tonight. The 5 Dons have agreed to gather at a location only I know. I'm going to bring them the microfilm. I'm going to present Rafe's betrayal in full, with documentation." She looked at him. "And you're going to come with me. Not to speak, not to negotiate. To stand there and let them see that you know what happened and you're not running from it." Dante said, "And if they decide the cleanest solution is, then that's the risk," Elena said. "That's what the necklace costs. That was always what it cost." She held his gaze. "Your father took that risk. I've taken it every day for 11 years. Now it's your turn." He started to answer. His phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. From Rafe. He read it. It said, "Brother, where are you? Getting worried. Call me." Brother. Dante set the phone face down on the table. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Elena, then at the necklace. He picked up the necklace, turned it in his hands, found the clasp mechanism, the tiny raised seam Elena had described, and pressed it the way she showed him with a slight movement of her chin. The compartment opened. Inside, smaller than a thumbnail, was a dark strip of film. He closed it again. He set the necklace back down. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," Elena confirmed. He stood up. His legs ached and his eyes burned, and he had been awake for over 24 hours, and somewhere across the city, Rafe Calder was sending him texts that said "brother" and making calls to people who wanted to bury him. He said, "I need to know one more thing." "What?" "Sienna, when this is over, wherever she lands, is she safe?" Elena looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face. "Yes," she said. "I made that arrangement already." He nodded. He walked toward the door. Behind him, Elena said, "Dante." He stopped but didn't turn. "You asked me what I needed from you. Nobody has asked me that in a very long time." A pause, brief and loaded. "I noticed." He stood there for 1 second. 2. Then he opened the door and walked out into the machine shop, and behind him he heard Elena pick up her phone and begin making the calls that would either save what remained of the Vescari empire or end it completely, and he understood for the first time that those 2 outcomes had always depended on the same thing. Not the name on the door, not the necklace, not the soldiers or the accounts, or the leverage in a microfilm strip smaller than his fingernail, but on whether Dante Vescari was finally capable of getting out of his own way long enough to let the person who'd been holding everything together actually do it. He wasn't sure yet that he was capable of that, but for the first time in his life, he was trying. And in the parking lot behind the machine shop, watched by 2 men Elena had positioned there since 4 in the morning, a black SUV sat idling 2 blocks north. And behind its wheel, watching the building's side entrance with the particular stillness that was his defining quality, Rafe Calder held his own phone and waited for Dante to make the mistake that would finally give him everything he wanted. Rafe Calder had been sitting in that SUV for 47 minutes when Dante walked out of the machine shop's side entrance, and in those 47 minutes, he had made 9 phone calls, sent 14 texts, and arrived at a conclusion he'd been building toward for 2 years. The conclusion was simple. The window was closing. He watched Dante cross the parking lot to his car. Not hurrying, not looking around, moving with the specific, deliberate quality of a man who has just received information that changed the shape of everything. Rafe knew that walk. He'd watched Dante walk that way after his father's funeral, after the Hargrove situation, after the 3 federal subpoenas that had each been made to disappear through mechanisms Dante had never fully understood. He knew what it meant. It meant Dante had stopped improvising and started calculating. That was the version of Dante that was actually dangerous. Rafe gave him 4 minutes of distance, then pulled the SUV into traffic 2 blocks back and followed. He already knew where Dante was going. He'd had a tracker on Dante's car for 16 months. He watched the blue dot on his phone move south through mid-morning Saturday traffic, and he thought about the phone call from Elena the previous night. Her voice controlled and slightly warm in the specific way she performed warmth for him, the version of herself she'd been showing him for 8 months while he fed her small verified truths and watched to see what she did with them. He had believed, until approximately an hour ago, that Elena was the most useful asset he'd ever cultivated. Then his contact at the Castillo organization had called him with a piece of information that reoriented everything. The Dons had agreed to a meeting. Tonight. At a location arranged by Elena Marcelli. All 5 families. Rafe had not been invited. He sat with that for a moment in the SUV, the city moving past the windows, the blue dot on his phone tracking steadily southeast. He ran back through the last 8 months the way you reread a letter, looking for what you missed the first time, and he found it in small things. The questions Elena had asked that were slightly too precise, the information she'd shared that was always slightly too useful, the way she'd never once pushed against him or challenged anything he said, which wasn't the behavior of a woman being won over. It was the behavior of a woman managing a source. She'd been running him. The machine shop, when Dante's dot stopped there, confirmed enough. He knew whose holding that building was. He'd spent 2 years mapping the Marcelli family infrastructure, and that property had always sat on the edge of his information, registered under a name he couldn't quite resolve, connected to accounts he could see the surface of, but not the bottom. Elena had brought Dante into Marcelli territory, which meant the alliance between them was already operational, already moving, and whatever was planned for tonight was further along than he'd realized. Rafe pulled to the curb and sat for a moment, the engine idling, his hand flat on the steering wheel. He was not a man who panicked. He'd survived things that should have ended him through the specific application of calm. Not the performance of calm, but genuine metabolic stillness. The ability to slow his own pulse by deciding to, the way other people decided to breathe. It was the quality that had made him valuable to Dante, and it was the quality that had made him dangerous to everyone else. And he used it now, sitting on that street, to think clearly about what came next. He had the Hargrove file, original documentation, physical copies, stored in a location only he knew, with a secondary storage that would activate automatically if he went more than 72 hours without a specific check-in. He had the federal contact, a relationship built over 4 years, that could be activated or deactivated depending on what served his interests. He had the Castillo connection, independent of the Vescari structure, an alternative network he'd been quietly building since he understood, about 2 years ago, that Dante's tenure was not going to end well. What he did not have was the microfilm. He needed the microfilm. Without it, the Hargrove file was leverage against Dante. Useful, but finite. Dante could be destroyed or he could capitulate, and either way the resulting power vacuum would be contested and chaotic. And Rafe had no interest in chaos. He wanted structure. He wanted to step into an intact organization that recognized him as the continuation rather than the interruption. The microfilm changed everything because it didn't just implicate Dante. It connected all 5 families to a mutual obligation that could be leveraged, carefully, to ensure a smooth transition. Romano Vescari had understood that the real power wasn't in having the biggest gun. It was in holding the document that made everyone else's guns irrelevant. Rafe needed that document, which meant he needed the necklace, which meant he needed Sienna. He put the car in gear. Sienna had not moved from the couch since Dante left. She'd made herself another cup of coffee and then not drunk it, and she sat with it going cold in her hands the same way Elena had sat in the Vescari kitchen the night before. And she wondered if there was something about the women in Dante Vescari's life that made them sit with cooling beverages and think about what they'd agreed to and why. She heard the knock on the apartment door and assumed it was the building's weekend concierge with a package, because that happened sometimes on Saturday mornings, and she crossed the room without checking the peephole. She opened the door and found Rafe Calder. Her body understood before her mind did. She felt it in her stomach and her throat simultaneously, a cold drop, a tightening. And she kept her face from doing anything, which cost her something, and she said, "Rafe, this is early." "Can I come in?" he said. Not a question. She stepped back from the door. He came in and looked at the apartment the way he always looked at rooms. Comprehensive, deliberate. cataloging the exits and the sight lines and the position of everything before he decided where to stand. He chose the center of the living room. He didn't sit. "You talked to Dante," he said. "He came here, yes." "What did you tell him?" Sienna set the coffee down on the counter. She kept her voice at the register she'd practiced. Not defensive, not aggressive, simply present. A woman answering a question. "I told him I'd tried to warn him about the bloodstone, that the families had protocols and he'd ignored the warning. That's all. That's all that mattered this morning." Rafe looked at her for a moment. He had a way of looking at people, not hostile, not warm, simply accurate, that Sienna had always found profoundly uncomfortable because it was the gaze of someone who was resolving you into data rather than seeing you. She held it without looking away. "Elena's been in contact with you," he said. Something happened in her chest, controlled and invisible. "Elena's his wife," she said. "She's been in contact with everyone." "Not like this." He took a step toward her. Not threatening, deliberate. One step, measured. "I've been watching Elena's communication patterns for 8 months. She's careful, but patterns exist. And the one thing that's been consistent is a contact in this building's network. A phone registered to a holding company that traces to a Marcelli address. Receiving calls from a number that traces to another holding company that also traces Marcelli." He paused. "That's you." Sienna said nothing. "The thing about Elena," Rafe said, his voice staying very even, "is that she doesn't make redundant moves. If she's been running you as a contact for 7 months, it's because you had access to something she needed." He tilted his head slightly. "The only thing in this apartment that Elena would need access to is Dante. And the only thing about Dante that Elena couldn't track herself is what he was saying in private to his lieutenant." He looked at her. "That's me. You've been watching me." Sienna met his gaze. "You're describing an elaborate theory, Rafe." "I'm describing what I know." He took another step. "I'm not here to punish you for it. I'm here because the situation has changed, and you need to understand what that means for you specifically." He paused. "Elena's meeting with the Dons tonight, whatever she's told you. The plan is, whatever she's promised you at the end of it, the plan has a significant problem." "What problem?" "Me," he said simply. "She built the plan without fully accounting for what I know, what I have, and what I'm willing to do with it. She thinks the microfilm ends this. It doesn't. Because even with the microfilm, even with the mutual protection documentation, the Hargrove file makes Dante untouchable by the families. They can't protect him from federal action, and federal action is exactly what I can deliver if tonight's meeting produces the outcome Elena is planning." Sienna was very still. 18 people, Rafe said. Documented. Physical evidence with chain of custody. I hand that to the right person. Dante Vescari doesn't get a transition or a negotiated exit. He gets a cell. He paused. Elena knows this, which means her plan involves removing the file from the equation before I can use it, which means she's planning to move against me tonight, before or during the meeting. He looked at her steadily. "I'd like that not to happen." "What do you want from me?" Sienna said. "The necklace," he said. "Specifically the clasp. Specifically what's inside it." "I don't have the necklace. Dante put it on me last night and Elena has it now." "I know, but you know the authentication, the mechanism for the compartment." He watched her face. "Elena showed you." Sienna said nothing, which was itself a confirmation, and they both knew it. Rafe reached into his jacket and set something on the counter beside her cold coffee. It was a phone. He said, "There are 2 messages on that phone. One is a photograph of your sister in Portland. The other is a message from my contact at the agency confirming that your sister's application for a federal contractor license, which she's been waiting on for 8 months, can be approved or denied depending on a phone call I make in the next few hours." He looked at her. "I'm not threatening her. I'm explaining that the reach I have extends further than this room." Sienna looked at the phone. Her jaw was tight. "Tell me the authentication," he said. "Describe the mechanism. I'll take care of the rest." She looked up at him. Something behind her eyes had gone from controlled to cold, a shift of degrees so small that anyone else would have missed it. "And what happens to me?" "You walk away. Same deal Elena offered you, I imagine. Enough money to go somewhere and start over. No further obligation." He paused. "Elena's deal requires tonight's meeting to go her way. Mine doesn't require anything to go anyone's way. It just requires this conversation. Sienna looked at the phone on the counter. She looked at Rafe. She said, "The clasp has a secondary release. You press the primary latch and hold for 3 seconds, then slide the guard plate left while maintaining pressure. The compartment opens inward, not outward, so first-timers always miss it." She paused. "That's what Elena showed me." Rafe nodded slowly. Something in his face relaxed by a fraction. He picked up the phone from the counter. He said, "Thank you." He walked toward the door. "Rafe," she said. He stopped. "Elena knows about your federal contact," she said. "She's known for 3 weeks. Whatever you're planning to do tonight, she's already accounted for it." Rafe was quiet for a moment. "Is that a warning?" "It's information," she said. "What you do with it is your problem." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, the first flicker of genuine uncertainty she'd ever seen on his face, and then it was gone, and he walked out of the apartment and the door clicked shut behind him. Sienna stood in her living room for 5 seconds. Then she picked up her personal phone and called Elena. Elena answered on the first ring. Sienna said, "He just left. He came for the authentication." "I know," Elena said. "I had the building monitored. I saw him come in." A pause. "Did you give it to him?" "I gave him the false sequence," Sienna said. "The one you told me to give him if he found me." A brief silence. "Good. He knows about the meeting tonight. He has a source in the Castillo organization." "Yes, Christoph Brauer told me an hour ago. We have a leak." Elena's voice stayed measured, but underneath it, something had tightened. "We're moving the location. He also said the Hargrove file is insulated. Even with the microfilm, he can activate the federal contact independently." "I know." The tightness was more audible now. "That's the part I haven't resolved yet." "Elena." Sienna gripped the phone. "He knows I've been watching him. He didn't say it directly, but he knows. If the meeting tonight goes wrong, go to the secondary location," Elena said. "The address I gave you last week. Stay there until I contact you." A pause. "Don't go anywhere else. Don't contact Dante. Don't contact anyone from the Vescari structure." "What are you going to do?" Elena was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'm going to do what I always do," she said. "Figure out what everyone else missed." And she hung up. Dante had been driving in a widening circle around the machine shop for 30 minutes, giving Elena time to make her calls and giving himself time to think, when his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it because he was answering everything now, operating on the principle that the call he ignored would be the one that mattered. The voice on the other end was old, slightly hoarse, unmistakable. "Vincent Corvo." "Drive to the West Side Yard," Corvo said. "The old Vescari shipyard. You know the main warehouse." Dante said, "Don Corvo, the meeting tonight isn't until—" "This isn't the meeting," Corvo said. "This is before the meeting. There's something you need to see before you walk into that room tonight." A pause. "I've known your family for 40 years, boy. I'm not your enemy today. But if you go into tonight without understanding what's in that warehouse, you'll walk out of it in a way you won't recover from." The line went dead. Dante held the phone and stared at the road ahead. Everything in him said it was a setup. Everything in him said Corvo was compromised or coerced or lying, and that the shipyard was the wrong place to be, and that the right move was to call Elena and tell her about the call and wait for instructions. He turned toward the West Side Yard. The old Vescari shipyard had been decommissioned for 11 years, a sprawling complex of warehouses and docking infrastructure on the river's edge that Romano Vescari had used for 30 years as the physical backbone of the import operation before federal scrutiny made it untenable. Dante had been there as a child, had watched his father walk those warehouses with the particular proprietary satisfaction of a man who has built something. After Romano died, it had sat, not sold, not developed, simply held, maintained minimally, part of the estate that nobody had known what to do with. The main warehouse was unlocked. Dante pushed the door open and stepped into the smell of river water and old wood and the particular metallic cold of a large empty space that hasn't been heated in years. The light inside was gray and flat, coming through high windows filmed with grime. He could see maybe 40 feet. He heard movement to his right and turned. Rafe Calder was standing 15 feet away. Beside him, pale and rigid with the specific stillness of someone managing fear, was Sienna. Dante's chest went cold. "I told Elena to keep you away from her," he said. His voice came out very quiet. "Elena's not running this part," Rafe said. "How did you get to her?" "She opened the door." Rafe's voice was as even as always, the surface of still water, nothing underneath that you could see. Which speaks to how quickly things are moving this morning. She wasn't being careful enough. He paused. "She's here because I needed a reason for you to stay in the room long enough to have a real conversation." Sienna looked at Dante. Her face said, "I'm sorry. I didn't have a choice." He read it clearly. He also read the thing she was trying not to show, which was fear, genuine fear, not the managed professional version she'd had in the apartment, but the animal kind. Dante made himself stay still. "Talk," he said to Rafe. Rafe reached into his jacket and set a thick envelope on a crate between them. Dante didn't move toward it. "Hargrove," Rafe said. 6 years ago, 18 people. You know what happened. I know what happened. The documentation in that envelope is the original. Not a copy, not a summary. Physical evidence sufficient to produce federal charges. I've been holding it for 2 years. "Why?" Dante said. "Because I didn't know yet what I was going to need it for." Rafe paused. "Now I do." "What do you need it for?" "I need you to call Elena," Rafe said. "Tell her the meeting tonight doesn't happen. Tell her whatever plan she's built around that microfilm gets stood down. Tell her that the Vescari organization does a managed transition, structured, negotiated, nothing burns, to new leadership." He paused. "My leadership." Dante looked at him. 11 years, every crisis, every tight room, every impossible situation where Rafe had been the one beside him who stayed clear and stayed functional. He thought about the photograph of Romano and the old Don, and Elena at 20 in the background, and the note that said, "Ask what's inside the necklace." He thought about the envelope on that kitchen counter and the long chain of arranged moments that had brought him to this specific warehouse on this specific morning. He thought about Sienna standing rigid 15 feet away. He said, "Let her go." "Call Elena first." "Let her go," he said again, "and I'll call Elena." Rafe looked at him for a moment. Then he said to Sienna, "Walk to the door." She looked at Dante. He gave her nothing, kept his face flat and forward, because the thing he needed most right now was for her to be out of the room, and he didn't want her to read anything in his face that made her feel like she needed to stay. She walked to the door. Her footsteps on the concrete were the only sound. The door opened, daylight flared in briefly, closed. Dante breathed. "Now," Rafe said, "call Elena." Dante took out his phone. He looked at it. He pressed Elena's name. She answered on the second ring. He said, "Elena, I need you to listen." He paused. "I'm at the shipyard. Rafe has the file. He wants the meeting canceled and a managed transition." Another pause. "He has Hargrove in original documentation." He kept his voice level. "What do you want me to do?" A silence on Elena's end. Not surprise silence, processing silence. He knew the difference. Then she said, "Hand the phone to Rafe." He held the phone out. Rafe took it and brought it to his ear. His eyes stayed on Dante. "Elena," he said. Whatever she said to him, Dante couldn't hear it, but he watched Rafe's face, and somewhere in the first 30 seconds of that conversation, the stillness that was Rafe's defining quality developed a crack. Small, structural, the kind of fracture you only see if you've been looking at something long enough to know what it looks like without the crack. Rafe said, "That's not possible." More silence on his end. Listening. Then he said very slowly, "You have the original." He stopped talking. His face was doing something Dante had genuinely never seen it do in 11 years. He lowered the phone. He looked at Dante. His voice came out at a different register. Still controlled, but different, the control working harder than usual. "She says she has the original Hargrove documentation." A pause. "She says the file I have is a copy." Dante said nothing. "She says your father pulled the original from the attorney's office in 2018 after the situation was resolved. Romano Vescari. He had the original sequestered." Rafe's jaw tightened. "She says it's been in the Marcelli family's custody since Romano died." He looked at Dante. "Did you know this?" "No," Dante said. "She says the copy I have is still sufficient for federal purposes, but that she has a counter document, a notarized testimony from the two survivors of Hargrove that contradicts the evidentiary chain. He breathed through his nose. She says if both documents enter the record simultaneously, the prosecution collapses. He stared at Dante. She's been holding a counterdoc for 6 years. Sounds like Elena, Dante said. Rafe looked at him. For the first time in 11 years, Dante saw something in Rafe's eyes that wasn't calculation. It was the expression of a man who has just realized how far back the thing he missed actually started. It was not a small realization, and it cost him something to have it. He raised the phone again. He said, "What do you want?" Dante heard Elena's voice clearly from 3 feet away. She said, "I want you in that room tonight. I want you to stand in front of 5 Dons and tell them exactly what you've been building and who you've been talking to. All of it." Rafe's hand on the phone tightened. "And if I don't, then both documents enter the federal record," Elena said, "and you can watch everything collapse from a distance and know that you had the chance to stand up in a room and answer for it like a man who respected the people he worked with, and you chose not to." A pause. "Your choice, Rafe, but make it in the next 10 seconds because I have other calls to make." Rafe stood in the cold warehouse with the phone at his ear and the sound of the river against the docks outside and the envelope of documentation on the crate between him and Dante, and he made the calculation that had defined his entire professional life: clean, fast, forward, and he arrived at a conclusion he had never expected to arrive at. He said, "I'll be there." He handed the phone back to Dante. Dante put it to his ear. Elena had already hung up. He lowered it. They stood in the warehouse 6 feet apart, the envelope between them. 11 years of something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite partnership and was definitely oversitting in the air around them. Rafe said, "She planned this whole thing." "Yes," Dante said, "since before last night." "Since before us, probably." Dante looked at him. "She's been at this longer than either of us understood." Rafe's jaw worked. He looked at the envelope on the crate. He said, "I built 11 years. "I know. I carried things for you that nobody else would have carried." "I know," Dante said again, "and she still outplayed both of us." Dante said nothing for a moment. Then, "She outplayed me first. You just thought you were using that." He looked at the floor between them. "Tonight you have to stand in a room and say what you did. All of it." He looked up. "I'm going to stand there too, with everything I did." He paused. "That's what the room is. That's what she's built." Rafe was quiet for a long time. The river sounds came through the warehouse walls. Finally he said, "What happens after?" "I don't know," Dante said. "I don't think that's up to either of us anymore." Rafe picked up the envelope from the crate. He held it for a moment, then set it back down and walked away from it, toward the warehouse door. And his footsteps on the concrete were steady and measured, and gave nothing away because even now, even at the edge of everything collapsing, Rafe Calder walked like a man who had decided how to move through a room and was not going to let a warehouse full of consequences change his gait. The door opened, light, closed. Dante stood alone in the old Vescari warehouse with the envelope on the crate and the smell of river water and the specific quality of silence that exists in a space built for something that is no longer happening. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. He looked at the documents inside, his name, the date, the location, the numbers, and he felt something move through him that he couldn't name. Not shame, exactly. Not grief. Something older and more structural, the feeling of a wall you've been leaning on for 6 years finally giving way, and finding out that the ground beneath your feet is solid after all, and the wall was the thing that was going to kill you. He put the documents back in the envelope. He folded it under his arm. He walked out of the warehouse into the gray Saturday light with the river behind him and the city ahead. And somewhere across that city, Elena Marcelli was making calls and moving pieces and building toward a room where everything he'd done and failed to do was going to be laid out in front of the 5 most dangerous men on the eastern seaboard. And he was going to stand in it without flinching. And the only question that remained, the only question that had ever actually mattered, was whether Dante Vescari was finally the kind of man who could stand in that room and not look for the exit. He didn't know the answer yet, but outside the warehouse's north wall, engine idling, a third vehicle waited. Not Rafe's SUV, not Elena's people. A black sedan with federal plates and a driver who had been listening through a device planted in Rafe's jacket 6 weeks ago by a contact inside his own network. A contact he had never known was doubled. And in the back seat of that sedan, a man with a recorder and a warrant, and the particular patience of someone who has been waiting a very long time for exactly the right moment, pressed the stop button on his device and reached for his phone to make a call that would arrive in Elena Marcelli's hand in 40 seconds and change every calculation she had made. Elena's phone rang at 12 minutes past noon, and the number that came up on the screen made her close her eyes for 1 second before she answered. The man on the other end didn't introduce himself. He said, "You have a problem." His name was Garrett Moss. I was 46 years old, a senior investigator with the Organized Crime Division of a federal agency that had been building a case file on the Vescari organization for 4 years. And he was the contact that Rafe had been cultivating, or believed he had been cultivating, for 31 months. He was also, as Elena had discovered 11 weeks ago through a source inside the agency's administrative structure, not entirely Rafe's asset. He had his own agenda, his own timeline, and his own understanding of what the Vescari situation was worth to him professionally. "I know about the device," Elena said. A pause. "Then you know what we have." "You have Rafe making an explicit threat to Dante at the shipyard. You have him acknowledging the Hargrove file exists. You have him proposing a criminal conspiracy to effect an organizational takeover." She walked to the window of the machine shop office, her back to the room. "What you don't have is a clean chain of custody on the device. You planted it in his jacket 6 weeks ago without a warrant." Silence. "The warrant came after," she said, 12 days after. "I have the filing date." More silence. Then, carefully, "That's a procedural issue. It doesn't invalidate. It invalidates the recording in federal court," Elena said. "You know that, and I know that, and whatever assistant U.S. attorney you're planning to hand this to will know it within 10 minutes of looking at the timeline." She paused. "Which means what you actually have is leverage over me, not a prosecution." Moss exhaled slowly. "I want to be in the room tonight." "No." "Mrs. Vescari, no federal presence at that meeting, non-negotiable." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "What I will do is provide you after tonight with the complete Hargrove documentation, original and copy, along with a sworn account from 2 witnesses, submitted through proper channels, with clean chain of custody, sufficient to produce the indictment you've been trying to build for 4 years. She paused. "Against the right person." Another pause. Longer this time. "Calder." "Rafe Calder ordered Hargrove," Elena said. "Dante Vescari authorized a different operation that night, and Calder modified the scope without disclosure. The documentation proves it if you look at the authorization timestamps against the operational log." She let that sit for a moment. "Dante made it possible by not asking enough questions. Calder made it happen by deciding the answer to questions he was never asked." Moss was quiet for 8 full seconds. Elena counted them. "Tonight," he said, "whatever happens in that room, stays in that room," Elena said. "You get your case. You get it clean. You get it after." She hung up before he could negotiate further. She stood at the window for a moment. Outside, the garment district moved through its Saturday. Trucks, deliveries. The ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what was being arranged inside this particular building on this particular afternoon. She turned back to the room. 2 of her father's men were standing near the door. She said to the taller one, "Move the location, the pier at Calvano Point instead of the warehouse. Tell the Don's representatives the change is for security," which is true. She picked up the bloodstone from the table where it had been sitting since morning. She clasped it around her own neck. "And get Dante on the phone. He needs to know about Moss before he walks into anything else." The man nodded and stepped out. Elena looked down at the necklace against her collarbone. The rubies caught the flat office light. She thought about Romano Vescari clasping it here, in almost this exact gesture, 20 years ago when she was 19 and thought she understood what she was agreeing to. She had been right about the structure of it, the weight, the duration, the cost. She had been wrong about exactly one thing, and that one thing had made the 19 years harder than Romano had told her they would be. She hadn't expected to care about him. She fastened the clasp and got back to work. Dante took the call from Elena's man at 12:31, pulled over on a bridge with the river below him and the city on both sides, and learned about Garrett Moss in 3 minutes flat. He sat with it for another 2 minutes after the call ended, running the permutations the way Elena had apparently been running them for weeks, and arrived at the same place she had. Rafe hadn't just been building a parallel network. He had been positioning a federal relationship as a pressure valve, a threat he could deploy if internal leverage wasn't enough. Which meant Rafe had always understood that taking the Vescari organization from Dante by force was the worst-case scenario. He'd wanted a transition that looked voluntary. He'd wanted Dante to step aside or be maneuvered aside, with the families intact and the infrastructure undamaged. He had never intended to burn the empire. He'd intended to inherit it. Which was... Dante sat with this for a moment, staring at the river, which was almost exactly what Elena had been doing for 19 years, except she'd been doing it with Dante's knowledge constructed around her rather than against him. And the purpose had been to eventually hand it back rather than to seize it. The difference between Elena and Rafe was not capability. It was not even intelligence. It was what they'd planned to do at the end. He put the car in gear and drove toward Calvano Point. The pier at Calvano Point was a private shipping facility on the river's eastern bank, decommissioned from active freight use 7 years ago and maintained by a consortium that, if you trace the corporate structure far enough, resolved into a group of holding companies with Marcelli fingerprints on 3 of them. It was surrounded by water on 2 sides and a chain-link perimeter on the other 2, the nearest neighboring structure a warehouse 400 meters away. It was, from a security standpoint, nearly ideal. Limited approach vectors, clear sight lines, nowhere to put a listening device that Elena's team wouldn't find. She had chosen it for those reasons, and one additional one. Romano Vescari had signed the 1987 Mutual Protection Pact at this pier. The 5 Dons who had been there that night were all dead now, but the men who had inherited their chairs knew the story, and standing in that location meant something. Location was its own argument. Elena understood that completely. The Dons arrived separately between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, each with a 2-man security detail that was asked to wait outside the pier's main building while the principals met inside. Don Corvo arrived last at 3:58, and he paused at the entrance to look at Elena for a long moment before nodding once and going in. Dante arrived at 4:03. He was unshaved and his clothes were the same ones from the night before, and he looked like a man who had been through something, which he had, and Elena met him at the door. She looked at him. He looked at the bloodstone at her throat. "Moss," he said. "Handled. For now." She looked at his face. "Are you ready?" "No," he said. "Let's go." She almost smiled. She didn't, but almost. They went in together. The interior of the pier building was a large open space. Concrete floors, exposed steel frame, high windows, a long table that Elena's people had set up at the center with chairs for 8. The 5 Dons were already seated. Their security was outside. The only other person in the room was Rafe Calder, who was standing near the far wall with his hands in his pockets and his face set in its standard configuration of controlled stillness, and who looked at Dante when he walked in with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, but occupied some exhausted territory between them. Dante looked back at him without stopping. He sat at the table. Elena sat beside him. Rafe, after a moment, took the remaining chair on the opposite side. Don Corvo said, "Let's begin." Elena spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. She set the microfilm reader on the table, a small device, old technology but functional, and threaded the strip from the bloodstone's compartment through it and projected the document onto the white wall behind her using a portable unit. The 1987 Pact. Romano Vescari's signature. The 5 predecessor signatures beside it. The language of the mutual obligation, dense and formal and absolutely clear in its implications. The room was completely quiet. She then set the Hargrove file on the table, the original, the copies, and the counter documentation, and walked through the timeline. The authorization with Dante's signature. The operational modification logged 19 minutes later, under Rafe's access code. The scope change that transformed a surveillance operation into something with 18 names attached to it. Rafe sat across the table and did not look at the documents. He looked at the wall past Elena's left shoulder and breathed with the slow deliberateness of someone managing their own physiology. When Elena finished, Don Ferrante said, Calder, you want to tell us about the federal contact? Rafe looked at him. He took a long breath. And then he said, not defensively, not apologetically, in the same level voice he used for everything. His name is Garrett Moss. I've been cultivating him for 31 months. My intention was to hold the relationship as leverage against anyone who moved against a transition I believed was necessary. He paused. I've been watching Dante make decisions for 11 years. I believe the organization was better positioned under different leadership. I built toward that. I didn't hide it from myself, and I'm not going to hide it from this room. Silence. Don Lenza said, you were going to use a federal asset against a member of this table. Against Dante, Rafe said. Not against any family. Not against this table. The distinction, Lenza said, is finer than you seem to think. I understand that now, Rafe said. He looked at the table surface for a moment. I understood it better this morning than I did yesterday. The room absorbed that. Dante had been sitting without speaking since they'd walked in. He could feel the weight of the Don's attention moving between him and Rafe and Elena like something physical, something that pressed against the skin. He was aware of his own heartbeat, the dull, persistent throb of it, too fast for the stillness of the room. I was aware of his hands on the table in front of him, the knuckles, the slight tremor he was suppressing by pressing his palms flat. He was aware that the next thing he said was either going to matter or it wasn't going to matter at all. Don Corvo looked at him. Dante, you signed the Hargrove authorization. Yes, Dante said. You're saying you didn't know the scope was modified. I'm saying I didn't ask enough questions to know. He kept his voice even, which is different from not knowing in the way that matters. I authorized something without understanding what I'd authorized. I didn't dig into the outcome because the outcome was, it served the organization and I let that be enough. He looked at Corvo directly. That's mine. I'm not putting that on Rafe's modification. It's both. What he did and what I failed to do. Corvo looked at him for a long moment. Your father, the old man said once that the hardest thing for a man of this kind to learn is that accountability and surrender aren't the same thing. He paused. He said most men never learn the difference. Dante said nothing. He said you'd need longer than most. The room was very quiet. Then the door at the far end of the pier building opened. Everyone at the table turned. 4 men came through the door. They weren't Elena's people. Elena's people were positioned outside, and the entry was supposed to be secured. These 4 were moving with the specific coordinated efficiency of people who had planned their entry and were executing it without hesitation. 2 went left, 2 went right, and the space of the room changed immediately, the geometry of it shifting from a negotiation to something else. Behind them, a 5th man walked in. Garrett Moss. He was in a suit, no badge visible, but the 4 men with him moved like law, carried themselves like law, and the room understood what they were even without credentials. Don Ferrante's jaw tightened. Christoph Brauer pushed his chair back slightly. Rafe went completely still in a new way. Not controlled stillness, but arrested stillness. The stillness of someone who has just seen the variable they didn't account for walk through a door. Moss stopped 10 feet from the table. He looked at Elena. We had an agreement, she said. Her voice was flat steel. We had a conversation, Moss said. An agreement requires both parties to have disclosed all relevant information. You didn't tell me about the 1987 document. He looked at the projection still on the wall. The Mutual Protection Pact, Romano's signature, the 5 predecessors. That document implicates 5 current organizations in an ongoing criminal conspiracy. I can't walk away from that on the basis of a phone call. That document, Elena said, is 38 years old and describes a protective agreement that has not been operationally active. Mrs. Vescari. Moss's voice was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was official. Please step back from the table. Don Corvo stood up. He was 73 years old and moved like it. But when he stood, the room changed around him the way rooms change when certain kinds of authority enter them, and Moss's 4 men all registered it without moving. Corvo looked at Moss with the expression of a man regarding something unfortunate and said, Young man, I have been in this business since before your agency existed in its current form. I have sat across from men with more authority than you and considerably better timing. You are making a mistake. Don Corvo, Moss said, I have a warrant for... You have a problem, Corvo said, because the device you used to collect what brought you here was planted before your warrant was issued, and there are currently 4 attorneys on retainer for the people in this room who will have that recording suppressed before you finish the paperwork. He looked at Moss steadily. And because the woman you interrupted has been trying to hand you a clean case for 6 hours, and you've just made it considerably harder to do that cleanly. Moss hesitated. It was a small hesitation, a fraction of a second, but Dante saw it, and Elena saw it, and Rafe saw it, and all 3 of them understood simultaneously that Moss had come here not because he had an airtight legal position, but because he was afraid of losing what Elena had promised him and had decided that physical presence was better than waiting. He was improvising. I was doing what Dante had done for 43 years, and it was going exactly as well. Elena said, "Moss." She didn't raise her voice. "Sit down." He looked at her. "Sit down." Something passed over his face. Calculations running, variables being reassessed. Then, without speaking, he pulled out the nearest empty chair and sat. The 4 men he'd brought stayed where they were. Nobody moved them. Nobody needed to. Elena looked around this table. The 5 Dons. Dante. Rafe. Moss. She looked at each of them with the expression of someone who has been managing a room full of difficult men for 19 years and has stopped being surprised by what difficult men do when they're frightened. She said, "Here is what is going to happen." Her voice in the high-ceilinged pier building was very clear. It didn't echo. It simply carried, the way voices do when a room has decided to listen. Rafe Calder is going to provide this table with a full accounting of his activities over the past 2 years, including the names of every contact, the scope of every parallel operation, and the full content of his relationship with Garrett Moss. She looked at Rafe. In exchange, the Hargrove documentation will be submitted to the federal system with the counter-testimony intact, which will produce a significantly reduced exposure for everyone in this room, including Dante, and will keep Rafe out of a federal facility provided he cooperates completely and permanently removes himself from any leadership role in any organization represented at this table. Rafe's jaw was working. He was looking at the table surface. He said very quietly, "You're ending my career." "I'm offering you a life outside one," Elena said. "There's a difference." He looked up at her. His face was doing something unprecedented. The control was there, but what it was containing had changed. Not anger, something more complicated. Something that had been building for 11 years under the professional surface, compressed and unexamined, finally finding the pressure too much to hold. He said, "You've been better at this than me from the beginning." "Yes," Elena said. "I have." A silence. Then Don Ferrante said, "And Dante." Everyone looked at Dante. He looked back at them. 5 men who had built their lives on the ability to read other men, to identify the gap between what was performed and what was real. He felt completely exposed and completely exhausted, and for the first time in his adult life, both of those things felt correct. He said, "I'll surrender operational control of the Vescari organization, completely and formally, to Elena." He paused. "Not because I'm being forced to, because it should have been hers 10 years ago, and I was too—" He stopped, tried again. "Because she's earned it, and I haven't. Not yet." He looked at the Dons. "I'd like the chance to." Don Corvo looked at him for a long time. The old man's face was unreadable in the specific way of faces that have absorbed too much history to react quickly to any single thing. Then Corvo looked at Elena. She held his gaze. "The bloodstone," Corvo said. Elena reached up and touched the clasp. She didn't remove it. Corvo nodded slowly. "Appropriate," he said. Don Ferrante said, "All in favor of recognizing Elena Marcelli Vescari as the operational authority of the Vescari organization and the holder of the mutual protection obligations therein." Every Don at the table said yes. The room held it for a moment. The weight of something being decided, something shifting in the architecture of power, a change that would ripple outward through the city in ways that none of the people present would fully understand for months. Then Rafe said, without preamble, without drama, in the same level voice he'd always used, "I'll cooperate, full accounting, all of it." Moss sat across from him with a recorder, sanctioned, warranted, within proper chain of custody, and prepared to listen. Dante looked at Elena. She was looking at Rafe and Moss, her attention already on the next thing, already managing the room, already 3 steps ahead of the moment. But she must have felt his gaze because she turned her head slightly and looked at him, briefly. And in the look was something that wasn't quite resolution and wasn't quite forgiveness, but was real, unmistakably, humanly real, in a way that the last 19 years, the whole constructed architecture of their arrangement, had mostly kept buried under the weight of purpose. He looked away first. It seemed like the right thing. Outside, the river moved against the pier in the late afternoon light, cold and indifferent and continuous. And somewhere above them, the gray sky was beginning to shift toward the early dark of autumn, and the city that held all of this inside it, the empire, the names, the weight of 40 years of arrangements and betrayals and agreements kept or broken. The city just kept going, as it always did, enormous and unconcerned, making room for whatever came next, the way it always made room for everything, without ceremony, without pause, without the faintest indication that anything inside it had changed at all. But something had. In a pier on the eastern bank of the river, with the water outside and the sky going dark above, and a man recording a confession that would take 2.5 hours to complete, the Vescari Empire changed hands for the first time in 40 years, not through violence, not through betrayal, but through 5 old men saying yes around a table, and one man finally saying he hadn't earned it, and one woman finally being told that she had. Dante sat at the edge of the table and waited for the accounting to finish, and he thought about nothing he could name, and his hands were finally still. And across the table, Rafe Calder talked, and the recorder ran, and Elena Marcelli, who had been running toward this room for 19 years, sat at its head with the bloodstone at her throat, and listened to the city outside settle into evening, and kept her face composed and let exactly none of what she felt show. Not victory, not relief, not the bone-deep exhaustion of a person who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and has only now been permitted to set it down. Because the room still required her, and the room always came first, and there would be time, later, in some quieter place, to feel whatever this actually was. That time was not yet. But it was coming, and outside, 3 floors below the window, Moss's men had used to enter. A car that none of Elena's security team had flagged sat with its engine off and its windows dark, and inside it, a man who was not Moss and was not federal and was not any kind of law reached for a phone and pressed send on a message that had been drafted for 6 hours, waiting for exactly this moment, the moment when everyone in that building believed the danger was resolved. And the message went to a number registered to an organization that none of the 5 Dons, none of Elena's contacts, none of Rafe's network had ever surfaced, because it predated all of them, because it was Romano Vescari's oldest enemy, the one debt he had never settled, the one name he had kept out of every document, including the 1987 pact, the one thread that Elena, in 19 years of preparation, had not found. And the message said simply, "They're all in the room." The message reached a phone that no one in the pier building was monitoring, and the man who sent it waited exactly 4 minutes before he made the next call. His name was Conrad Vale. He was 61 years old, and he had been waiting for this specific configuration, all of them in one room, occupied, their security focused inward, for longer than Elena had been preparing for anything. He had been Romano Vescari's business partner in the years before Romano chose the families over him, before Romano's testimony in a closed arbitration had cost him everything that had taken him 20 years to build. He had never forgiven it. He had also never rushed. Patient men, in Conrad Vale's experience, always outlasted the ones who moved too quickly, and he had made patience into something close to a discipline. He made the call. He said 2 words. He hung up. Elena felt it before she heard it, a change in air pressure, or something that registered in the body before the mind caught up. The specific wrongness of a room that has been breached. One of her men outside the pier door was supposed to check in every 8 minutes. It had been 11 minutes and 40 seconds since the last check-in, which she had noticed at the 9-minute mark and filed without acting on, because the meeting was at a delicate point and she was managing 6 variables simultaneously, and 9 minutes was close enough to 8 to seem like lag. 11 minutes and 40 seconds was not lag. She stood up from her chair. Dante looked at her. He read her face immediately, the way he had learned to read it in the last 12 hours. The slight tightening around the eyes, the stillness that wasn't composure, but preparation. He stood up too. What is it? Don Corvo said. Elena said, "We need to move. Now." She looked at her second man, who was stationed near the interior door. He was already on his radio, his face showing the same thing her body was showing. A bad answer to an urgent question. She said to him, "Marco?" He shook his head. Nobody outside was responding. The pier building had 3 exits. The main door they'd entered through, the emergency exit at the building's south end, and a freight loading door on the riverside that Elena had assessed upon arrival and dismissed as a primary vulnerability because it required keys to open from outside, and the keys were in the possession of the Marcelli Holding Company's facility manager, who was not a person anyone would know to contact. She had been wrong about the keys. The freight door opened. The sound of it, the heavy mechanical groan of a large door on old runners, filled the pier building from the river end, and the cold air that came through it smelled of water and the particular diesel and salt smell of the river at dusk. And with the cold air came 3 men moving fast, spread wide to maximize coverage of the space, and behind them a 4th, and behind the 4th, walking without hurry, Conrad Vale. I was a compact man, gray-haired, well-dressed, in a way that suggested old money or a careful imitation of it. He walked into the pier building where Romano Vescari's legacy was currently being redistributed among the people Romano had trusted, and he looked around at the table and the people at it with the expression of a man who has arrived at a party he was not invited to and has decided this constitutes his invitation. "Sit down," he said to the room at large. "All of you." Nobody sat. Vale's 3 men had positioned themselves to cover the table and the exits. They were professionals, not panicked, and their coverage was efficient. The 4th man, larger, standing just behind Vale, had a specific quality that Dante recognized from his own organization. The quality of someone who handles physical problems and has handled enough of them to be very calm about it. Don Ferrante said, from the table, with the voice of a man who has been in many dangerous rooms, "Who are you?" "My name is Conrad Vale," he said. "Romano Vescari owed me a debt that was never paid. Tonight I'm collecting from the estate." He looked at Elena. "The necklace, the microfilm inside it, that documentation, the 1987 pact, the mutual obligations, every signature belongs to me now." Elena looked at him. Her hands were at her sides. She was very still. "That document belongs to the 5 families who signed it." "It belongs to whoever holds it," Vale said. "That's always been the truth of it. Romano understood that. He took it from me when he testified against my holdings in '94, called it a necessary action, said he had no choice." His voice stayed even. He had a choice. He made the wrong one. He looked at the bloodstone at Elena's throat. "I've waited 31 years. I'm done waiting." Moss was still at the table, his recorder running with a helpless automated indifference. He looked at the men covering the exits and made the specific calculation of a federal officer who is the wrong kind of outnumbered in the wrong kind of room and said nothing. Rafe had gone completely still. Not his controlled stillness, a different kind. The kind that happens when a person who has spent years positioning themselves for advantage suddenly understands that all of their positioning is irrelevant because the board has been flipped. Dante was standing 3 feet from the table with the Hargrove envelope still under his arm and his heart beating at a rate he was trying to control and failing, and he was looking at Vile and thinking about the message he hadn't sent and the call he hadn't made and the old debt he hadn't known existed because Romano had kept it out of every document and every conversation. And he was thinking that the one thing Elena hadn't found was the one thing that was now standing in the room with them. He said, "Vile." The man looked at him. "Romano's been dead for 8 years, Dante said. Whatever he owed you, the debt doesn't transfer." "Everything transfers," Vale said pleasantly. "That's what inheritance means." "Then come to me. Not to this room, not to these people." Dante took a step forward. One of Vale's men moved in response and stopped when Vale raised a hand slightly. "Whatever Romano took from you, land, money, operations, make a number. I'll make it right." Vale looked at him with something like amusement. Not warm amusement. The amusement of someone watching an animal try a behavior that has never worked. "You don't have that kind of money anymore, do you? Not tonight." He glanced at Elena. "She does." Elena said, "The microfilm won't do you what you think it will. The pact isn't leverage against the families. It's a protective document. Holding it doesn't give you power over them. It makes you a target. Or it makes me appear, Vale said. The man who holds the agreement that protects everyone. The man you need to keep satisfied. He looked around the table at the 5 Dons. Romano used it that way for 30 years. I watched him do it. His voice dropped slightly. I helped him build it. The room went very quiet. Don Corvo said slowly, "You were at the 1987 meeting." "I arranged the 1987 meeting," Vael said. "The language, the framework, the signatures, that was my architecture. Romano brought the relationships. I brought the structure." He looked at Corvo directly. "He took my name off the document before the final version. Said it was cleaner that way. Said I wasn't family." Corvo's face didn't move, but something behind it did. Vael said, "I want the microfilm. I want the original documentation with my name added to the protective agreement as a 6th signatory. Not Romano's amendment, a current amendment, witnessed by everyone in this room." He looked around the table. "And I want the Vescari harbor access restored, the license Romano revoked in '94 when he testified." He paused. "That's it. That's the number." Dante looked at Elena. Elena looked at Vael. The harbor license was worth approximately $40 million annually in import access. Adding a 6th signatory to the Mutual Protection Pact would mean Vail's organization, whatever remained of it after 30 years of exile, would fall under the same protective umbrella as the 5 families. It was an enormous ask. It was also, Dante recognized with a particular cold clarity, survivable. It was something that could be negotiated, reduced, restructured. It was not the kind of demand that ended in a room full of bodies if both sides were rational. He was about to say this. Then Rafe Calder moved. He moved fast, faster than anyone at the table had expected from a man who had been sitting in controlled stillness for 2 hours. And he moved not toward the exits, but toward Vail's lead man. And what he was doing, Dante understood in the fraction of a second he had to understand it, was not trying to escape. He was trying to flip the position, to take a hostage of his own, to create a standoff that he could use as currency, the way he had always used leverage, because Rafe Calder in an impossible room defaulted to leverage the way other men defaulted to breathing. It almost worked. Vail's lead man was good, but Rafe was better than his size suggested, faster than 11 years of desk work implied, and he got an arm around the man's throat and 3 seconds of viable standoff position before Vail's second man hit him from the right. Not a clean strike, but sufficient. A blow to the shoulder that cost Rafe his balance. And then both of Vail's people had him, and the position collapsed, and Rafe went down to one knee on the concrete floor, breathing hard. The stillness finally broken. Finally just a man who had tried something and failed. One of Vail's men pressed a knee into Rafe's back and held him on the floor. The room had moved in the 6 seconds of chaos, and now resettled. And in the resettling, Dante found himself between Elena and the table, which was where he was without having decided to be there, his body having apparently made the decision independently. Vael looked at Rafe on the floor without particular emotion. "That was stupid," he said. Rafe, breathing through the pressure on his back, didn't answer. Vael looked at Dante. "The offer stands. It has a time limit." Dante looked at Elena. She was watching him. Not directing him. Watching him, the way she'd been watching him for 19 years, waiting to see what the current version of him was capable of. He thought about what she'd said in the machine shop office. For once, without arguing, without deciding you know better halfway through, he said to Vael, "Give me 5 minutes with the table." Vael looked at him for a moment, then he checked his watch. 5 minutes. Dante turned to the table. The 5 Dons looked back at him. Moss was recording all of it and had apparently decided that was the most useful thing he could do. Elena was beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, which was a strange thing to be aware of in this specific moment, but he was aware of it. He said quietly enough that Vael couldn't hear clearly, "His ask is survivable. The harbor license is worth $40 million a year. Split across 5 families, it's $8 million each. And the actual cost is closer to 2 because the license opens import channels that benefit everyone." He looked at each Don in turn. Adding him to the protective pact means adding a 6th party to an agreement that's already 38 years old and has never been tested in court. It costs us language on paper. Don Ferrante said, "And if he uses that language?" "He uses it the same way Romano used it, as a deterrent, as protection." Dante paused. which is what he wanted in 1987 before Romano cut him out. He looked at Corvo. You knew him then? Corvo said slowly, I knew who he was. Was he a man you could do business with? A very long pause. The old man's eyes went somewhere interior, 38 years back, a room Dante had never been in. Then, Romano didn't cut him out because he was untrustworthy. He cut him out because he was capable, and Romano wanted no equals. Corvo looked at Dante. He was a man you could do business with. Dante nodded. He turned back to Vael. He said, We'll give you the harbor license, restored, in full, through legitimate channels within 90 days. He paused. The Pact Amendment is conditional. You sit at this table for 12 months as an observer. No vote, no authority, no operational involvement. After 12 months, the 5 Dons vote on whether to formalize the 6th signature. He looked at Vael steadily. You prove in 12 months that you're a man worth keeping at the table. Then the document reflects it. Vael looked at him. Romano didn't trust the process, Dante said. He decided alone. I'm not him. He held Vael's gaze. Neither is this room. Vael was quiet for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated. The arithmetic of a man who has been waiting 31 years for something and is now being offered something adjacent to it, and is deciding whether adjacent is acceptable or whether it's another version of the same dismissal. Dante watched him work through it and did not speak, because he had learned in the last 18 hours that the most dangerous thing he could do in a room was fill silence that needed to breathe. Finally, Vael said, Release the man on the floor. The pressure on Rafe's back disappeared. Rafe got up slowly, one hand on the concrete for balance, his shoulder at a wrong angle where it had been hit. He straightened and looked at nobody specifically, which was the look of a man reassembling whatever dignity he could access. Vael said to Dante, 90 days on the license, 12 months observation. He paused. The microfilm stays with the necklace. Yes, Dante said, with her. He looked at Elena. Yes, Dante said again. Vael considered this. He looked at Elena for a moment, and in the look was something that Dante couldn't entirely read. Not hostility, not quite respect, something between them that suggested two people recognizing the same quality in each other across a room. Vael said, Romano should have chosen better. Elena said, he chose what he understood. A pause. Then Vael looked at his men. We're done here. They filed back out through the freight door, which groaned shut behind them, and the cold river air retreated, and the pier building held its silence for a moment in the way that rooms do after something dangerous has passed through them. Then Don Ferrante exhaled audibly and said something in Italian that Dante didn't catch, but that produced a brief sound from Don Lenza that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh. Moss stopped his recorder. He looked at the table, at the 5 Dons, at Elena, at Rafe standing with his damaged shoulder and his ruined career, and he said, with the voice of a man who has just witnessed something he has no adequate category for, I'm going to need a few minutes. Nobody responded. Rafe looked at Dante. He held the look for a moment, and in it was something that had never been there in 11 years of everything, the absence of calculation. Just a man, tired and hurt, looking at another man. He said, the Hargrove file. What happens to it? Dante looked at Elena. She said, it goes through Moss's office. Clean chain of custody. The counter-testimony goes with it. She looked at Rafe directly. You cooperate fully with the federal process, and you accept the reduced exposure. You don't go to a facility. You lose everything operational, and you stay out of this world permanently. Rafe was quiet. Permanently. Yes. He nodded. One small final nod, the kind that closes a door. All right, he said. He sat back down in his chair and looked at the table surface and said nothing else, and nobody asked him to. The meeting formally concluded at 7:41 in the evening. The 5 Dons left in the order they'd arrived, Corvo last, and before Corvo went, he stopped in front of Elena and looked at the bloodstone at her throat for a moment, and then at her face, and he said, Romano would have an opinion about tonight. Romano always had an opinion, Elena said. He'd be wrong about some of it, Corvo said. He usually was, about the things that mattered most. He paused. You did well. He left. Moss gathered his equipment and his warrant and the recording that contained more material than he'd expected and considerably less usable material than he'd hoped, and he stopped at the door and looked at Elena and said, "The 90-day timeline on Vale's license. If he moves operationally before the 12 months, I'll call you," Elena said. He nodded and went out. Cruz, Elena's second man, confirmed that the security team outside had been contained, zip-tied, not harmed, already cut loose and accounted for. Vale's people had been efficient and had not been gratuitous about it, which told Dante something about the kind of operation Vale ran even in its diminished state. The pier building emptied until it was just the three of them, Elena, Dante, and Rafe sitting in his chair with his shoulder and his silence. Then Rafe stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He didn't put it on. He held it. He looked at Dante, then at Elena, then at the table where the Hargrove documents still sat, the microfilm reader beside them, the projection device dark. He said, 11 years. Neither of them answered. "I was good at what I did," he said. Not defensively, just as a statement of fact that the room might as well hold. "I was." "You were," Dante said. Rafe nodded. He walked to the freight door, not the one Vale had used but the south emergency exit, and he pushed it open and went through it without looking back, and the door swung shut behind him on its hydraulic arm, very slowly, closing with a soft final click that was the least dramatic possible sound for the end of 11 years. Dante looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Elena. She was sitting on the edge of the table, which was the first informal posture he had seen from her in 24 hours, and she looked exactly as tired as she had earned the right to look. The bloodstone was at her throat, the rubies in the dim pier light not glamorous but simply present, doing what they'd been doing for 47 years. She had one hand pressed flat against the table beside her, and she was looking at the freight door through which Vial had come and gone, 31 years of patients arriving and departing in the space of 40 minutes. "You knew about Vial," Dante said. She looked at him. "Not completely," she said. "I knew Romano had a silent partner who had been cut out in the 90s. I knew his name. I didn't know his current capacity or his specific intent." She paused. "That's what I meant when I told Sienna the plan had a problem I hadn't resolved." She looked at the table. "I resolved it faster than I expected." "Because of me," Dante said. She looked at him. "Because of what you said to him. The 12-month observation offer." She paused. "I wouldn't have done it that way." "What would you have done?" "Something more controlled, more pre-negotiated. I'd have found him beforehand if I'd known his position clearly and arranged the terms before he walked into the room." She looked at the space where Vale had stood. "You improvised." "I improvised," Dante agreed. "It worked." "It worked," he agreed again. She looked at him. He looked at her. The room was very quiet, the river outside making its constant low sound against the pier, the sky through the high windows fully dark now, the city on the far bank a low steady glow. He said, "I owe you something." "You owe me a lot of things," she said. "I know. I'm starting with the one that matters most." He looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry. For last night. For all of it. For 19 years of watching you hold everything together and never asking what it was costing you." He paused. "I'm sorry I was exactly who Romano thought I was when he didn't trust me with it." Elena was quiet for a moment. Her hand on the table pressed slightly harder against the surface, a small, involuntary thing. She said, "Romano underestimated how you might change. He was right about who I was then." "Yes," she said, "but people change. Slowly and badly, and usually for the wrong reasons." She looked at him. "You changed tonight." "I changed this morning," Dante said, "in the machine shop, when I finally asked what you needed instead of telling you what I intended." He paused. "That felt different. That felt like something I should have been doing for a long time." She looked at him for a moment, and what was in her face was not the managed expression of the last 19 years, not the composed competence, not the professional warmth she'd deployed for Don's and attorneys and Rafe Calder's careful cultivation attempts. It was something older than all of that, and considerably less protected. She said, "I didn't plan to feel what I felt about you." "I know. It complicated everything. I know that too. It made me better at it, actually," she said, "caring about the outcome, not just the structure." She looked at the bloodstone. Romano thought it was a liability. He told me once that emotional involvement with the principal was a weakness I needed to manage. She paused. He was wrong about that too. Dante said nothing for a moment. Then, what happens now? Now I run the organization, Elena said, formally and publicly, with the family's recognition and the pact documentation in place. The harbor license goes to Vale on the 90-day timeline. The federal process runs through Moss's office with a clean package. She looked at him. The Vescari name continues, different structure. And me? She looked at him directly. That depends on what you want. He thought about it, really thought about it, which was not something he had done often about his own wants, because his wants had always felt self-evident to him. The empire, the authority, the room that responded when he walked in. He sat with the absence of those things, the way they'd been stripped back in the last 24 hours, and found that the absence felt less catastrophic than he'd expected. Not painless, not clean, but survivable in a way that surprised him. He said, "I'd like to be useful." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "To me? To the organization? To whatever you're building?" He paused. Not in charge. Not making decisions. Just... He tried to find the right word and found that the right word was simpler than he wanted it to be. Present, accountable. Trying to understand what I didn't understand before. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a position," she said. "That's a person." "Yes," he said. "I know." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite, but the possibility of one, somewhere underneath the tiredness. She said, "Go home, Dante. Not the estate. It's being transferred to the organizational holding." She slid off the table and stood. "I had an apartment kept for transitional use. Cruz will send you the address." She picked up the microfilm reader and began packing it with the particular efficient care of someone who has handled equipment like this many times. "Get some sleep. Eat something." She paused without looking up. "We'll talk next week." He stood. He picked up his jacket from the floor where it had fallen during the chaos with Rafe and Vale. He looked around the pier building, the table, the chairs, the projected packed document space on the wall, now just a white rectangle of nothing. And he felt the particular quality of a room that has been used for something important and has now been vacated by it. He walked toward the exit. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. He said, "The necklace. My father said it went to the person the Empire most needed." "Yes," Elena said from across the room. "He put it on you," Dante said. "Not on me. In 2007 at that dinner, I thought it was a compliment to me." He paused. "I thought he was saying I'd chosen well." "He was saying I was necessary," Elena said. "It's not the same thing." "No," Dante said. "It isn't." He pressed his hand against the door. "He chose better than he knew, though, not just necessary." He paused. "Worth it." He went through the door before she could respond. Outside, the river air was cold and clean, and the city across the water was its own enormous and different self. And Dante Vescari walked the length of the pier with his jacket in his hand and his breath making small clouds in the dark. And he did not feel like a man who had won anything, which was correct because he hadn't. And he did not feel like a man who had lost everything, which was also correct because the most important things were still standing. He felt, for the first time in a long time, like exactly what he was. A man of 43 who had been given something he didn't deserve and had spent 20 years being unequal to it, and who was now at the particular beginning that only exists on the other side of a complete dismantling. Small. Real. Possible. He got in his car. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Sienna at the secondary address, waiting for Elena's call. He thought about Rafe walking through that emergency exit with his jacket and his shoulder and 11 years going out the door with him. He thought about Vael, somewhere across the city, 31 years of patience finally cashing in increments, which was not justice and was not injustice, but was the specific resolution that possible rooms produce when impossible men finally stop insisting on impossible outcomes. He thought about Romano Vescari placing the bloodstone around a 19-year-old woman's neck and saying the Empire most needs her, and being more right than he'd understood. He started the engine. He drove. 3 weeks after the pier, Sienna Vale left New York on a Tuesday morning with 2 bags and a wire transfer, and a name that was not Sienna Vale. and she took a connecting flight through Chicago to a city on the West Coast that she had visited once when she was 22 and had thought, even then, that she could live there. She rented an apartment with good light. She bought furniture that was hers. She did not contact anyone from the Vescari organization or the Marcelli family or the Five Families or Garrett Moss or Conrad Vale. She took a job doing bookkeeping for a restaurant group, which she was overqualified for and which suited her exactly, and she did the work carefully and went home in the evenings and sat with the particular quiet of a life that is finally, at whatever cost, her own. She kept one thing from the previous life, a photograph, small, that she'd taken with her phone the morning after Meridian, not of the event itself, but of the apartment window, the New York pre-dawn outside it, the moment just before everything changed. She put it in a drawer and didn't look at it often, but she kept it there because some things are worth keeping even when you're done with the life they came from. 6 weeks after the pier, the federal process produced its first filing. The Hargrove documentation, submitted through Moss's office with clean chain of custody and the counter-testimony intact, produced not the sweeping indictment Moss had originally anticipated, but a targeted one. Specific, narrow, naming. Rafe Calder as the operational authority for the scope modification that had produced 18 deaths. Dante was named as a cooperating witness whose authorization had been subverted without his knowledge, which was a characterization that contained truth and was also the result of documentation that Elena had been curating for 6 years. Rafe accepted a negotiated outcome that kept him out of a federal facility in exchange for full cooperation on 3 related investigations. He moved to a city he'd never lived in and started over in whatever way a man starts over from something like that. He did not contact Dante. He did not contact Elena. He left the way he'd left the pier, efficiently, without theatrics, in the way of a man who has made a calculation and is following it through. 2 months after the pier, on a Thursday afternoon in November, Dante came to the machine shop. Elena was in the back office. She looked up when Cruz showed him in, and she looked different in a way that he took a moment to identify. Not physically different, but carriage-wise. Something in the way she occupied the room that had changed now that she occupied it on her own terms, rather than on the terms she'd been managing around for 19 years. She looked like someone who had finally been allowed to sit in the chair they'd been built for. He sat across from her, the table between them. Same position as the morning after Meridian, the same geometry, a completely different room. He said, "How is it?" "Complex," she said. "Vail is behaving. The harbor license cleared the first administrative hurdle. Ferrante's people are adjusting to the new structure better than I expected." She looked at him. "Corvo called me last week. He said Romano would have been proud, which means Romano would have had 17 objections and kept them to himself." Dante almost smiled. "That sounds right." She looked at him steadily. "You?" "I've been talking to a man in the Bronx. He runs workforce development programs for people coming out of the correction system. He needs someone who understands organizational logistics." Dante paused. "I've been doing some consulting." Elena blinked once, just once. "Legitimately?" "Fully," he said. "It turns out I'm reasonably good at logistics when I'm not also running an empire." He paused. "It turns out a lot of things are easier when you're not also running an empire." She looked at him. The expression on her face was the one he'd seen briefly in the pier building, the one that wasn't quite a smile but had that territory in it. She let it stay there longer this time. She reached into the drawer beside her. She set the bloodstone on the table between them. Not toward him, just on the table, present, between. She said, "Your father put a test in a necklace and called it an heirloom." "Yes." "It was a cruel thing to do." "Yes," Dante said. "It was." He paused. He was a man who loved imperfectly and controlled precisely and thought those two things could coexist without damage. He looked at the rubies in the afternoon light. "They can't." "No," she said. "They can't." They sat with that for a moment. Elena picked up the bloodstone and put it back in the case she kept it in now. Not worn, not displayed, simply stored, the way things are stored when they've done their work and the work is finished. She closed the case. She set it aside. She said, "Come back next Thursday. There's a licensing issue with the harbor access that I'd like a second opinion on. Someone who understands the operational side." He looked at her. Is that... It's a job, she said. A specific, limited, legitimate consulting task for which I will pay you a fair rate and give you no authority whatsoever. She held his gaze. And then we'll see. He stood up. He picked up his jacket. He looked at the case on the shelf that held the bloodstone, closed, at rest, finished with being a test. Next Thursday, he said. Next Thursday, she agreed. He walked out of the office and through the machine shop and out into the November afternoon, which was cold and gray and smelled of the city, exhaust and concrete, and the particular sharpness of late autumn air. And he walked to his car, which was a different car than the one he'd driven here 6 weeks ago, smaller, less conspicuous, more honest about what he currently was. And he got in and drove back toward the Bronx with the heater running and the radio off and the city moving past the windows in its enormous ordinary way. And he thought about Thursday, and thought about what came before Thursday, and thought about the long specific distance between the man who had walked into Meridian 2 months ago expecting applause, and the man who was currently sitting in a compact car with a legitimate consulting appointment in his calendar, and no empire, and nothing ahead of him that was promised or guaranteed or arranged. It was, he thought, the most honest he had ever been. He drove. The city let him. That was enough.